Welcome to the Austin Public Library podcast and our second season of Reading for Life. My name is Julie Kleinfelter, Director of the Public Library in Austin, Minnesota, and we are here today to finish up our discussion of The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. The purpose of the Reading for Life program is to grow community around a shared love of literature. Real community begins and ends with our imaginations, and few resources are as vital to the imagination's development as works of literature. With me today is my co-host, Michael Verde, who founded Reading for Life in 2005. We're also joined today by Steve Harson, Public Library Consultant for the Southeastern Libraries Cooperating. Gentlemen, we are sorely missing Tim O'Brien today, who so graciously joined us for our last podcast. It was so amazing to have the author involved with our discussion, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about our conversation since. It keeps swirling around in my head, and I keep finding myself picking up the book and looking back at something else. It's just been amazing.
Yeah, I concur with that. Hey, just out of curiosity, Julie, what is one of the things that is swirling around in your head, just related to that book?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I kept coming back to was there's a couple chapters in the book that I remember when I read it through the first time, I kind of noticed, but then when I went back, kept popping up was he's got one chapter that's called what's it called? Hang on just a second. How to Tell a True War Story. And he talks about truth. And that's something that I think comes up a lot in some of these, what we call kind of classic books. The other chapter that brought it back up again was Good Form. And it's kind of that idea that the first chapter he talks about, what is a true war story and what makes it a true war story. And his whole point is that it's not always necessarily things that happened. In fact, he's got a great line on page, I don't know, everybody's got different pages, but on page 80, he says, he's talking about one of the stories. And he says, the last sentence is, that's a true story that never happened. And it made me think about other quotes that I've heard. And I know we're going to be reading Ursula Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness coming up. And she's got this amazing quote in her book that says, I talk about the gods. I am an atheist, but I am also an artist and therefore a liar. Distrust everything I say. I'm telling the truth. And that's what kept swirling back in my head as I was reading through his book.
And Julie, that's exactly the thing that I've mentioned a couple times, that his book is not a nonfiction factual recounting of the events of a war, but he's attempting to help the reader feel what it's like to be there. And that if you can feel that and have the sense of what it felt like to be there, then that's true, regardless of what the words are. And whether or not that's a recounting of an actual event. If you come away with the sense of what it was like to be there, then that's a true story.
Yeah.
And he does that masterfully throughout this book.
He really does. Yeah, I mean, it just, and he says, I want you to know why story truth is truer sometimes than happening truth. And he talks about at the end of that Good Form chapter that he says, this is why when Kathleen asks, Daddy, did you ever kill anybody? I can honestly say, of course not. Or I can say, honestly, yes. And it all goes back to those stories.
And truth also has cultural contexts that we sometimes don't really acknowledge in our society. There's this is the facts, just the facts, ma'am, that, this is exactly the things that happened being the truth. And then there are other concepts of the truth, and some of them common in Asian cultures, that the truth is the thing that makes you feel what happened or feel that. And that's hard sometimes for Americans to understand.
Yeah.
There's a 18th century philosopher, Giambattista Vico, who in the Latin, the phrase is verum factum, which means what is true is what we make. And we can imagine, for instance, if we want to understand a tree, this is an example, to a certain extent, there's always going to be a limitation because we didn't make the tree. We can try to understand it from the outside in, but we can never understand it in a sense from the inside out. And you would think from the perspective of the tree, what is most true is what the tree participates in. I'm just going to put that out there and consider for just a second how that would apply to human beings. We make, for instance, love. And I think we would agree that to really understand another person, you would have to have experienced them from the inside out in some way that only love seems to make possible. In other words, the mother that loves her son or the husband that loves his wife is going to understand that person from the inside out in the way that no one from the outside looking in. And I think we would agree, in other words, that there's a sense in which if we want to really understand something, we have to participate in it, which would suggest then that the war, to the extent that we participate in it, we could understand it. The sense that we read about it, we could never understand it. So if you're a writer and you want someone to experience something the way you experience, they're going to have to participate in it. And I think this relates to Steve's comment about feeling, because what we participate in, there will always be an emotive and affective and a visceral relationship with. So I would just say, with regards to writing, the writer wants to communicate something to you in which you participate in it, and by making meaning with it, just like making love. By making meaning with it, then you understand it in a way that you could never understand intellectually from the outside in. So I think that I would just want to throw that out there, that something doesn't really happen unless we are participated in its happening. It doesn't happen, in other words, it doesn't happen in a way that we can understand it unless we participate in its happening. This might seem like a philosophical issue, but for people who, for instance, have religious experiences or experiences they claim to be transcendent, and they want to communicate to other people something that's happened to them, part of the challenge is they've experienced something that you can't understand from the outside in. So the only way that other people can understand this experience is if they participate in it. If you see what I mean. Let me just give one concrete example, and then we don't have to go down this road very far, but just to bring the point home. If you wanted to understand what it meant to, if you were at the crucifixion, for instance, you might not have seen it happen. You may not have experienced it if you were watching it only from the outside in. You can imagine a camera being at the crucifixion and capturing all the details from the outside, and not have seen what would happen, because apparently to these people that were followers of Jesus, that didn't just happen on the cross, it happened inside of them. This figure came back alive in their bodies. You could not have captured that with a video camera. You could not have captured what happened in their body with a video camera. And I'm using that as an example because works of art are trying to do something like that. They want you to understand it, not the way a video camera would understand an event. They want you to understand it because it's happening inside of you. In a sense, you become the spot in which it happens again, which means it wouldn't just be in the past, it would be present. So I'm just throwing that out there. When we think about truth in the most intense way, I think we're often talking about two things becoming one thing. This is why I think you mentioned metaphors and symbols, Julie. Yes. A symbol comes from the word symbolon, which means a ticket. And when you have a symbol, you have one half of a ticket. And to complete the ticket, you have to get the other half of the ticket. And when you put those two symbolins together, then you have made the ticket whole. And another way of saying that would be, let's say you have two birds, apparently songbirds, and one of them, that they work out a song together. And if one of the birds disappears, like it does, the other bird can't sing the song because the song is in the two birds together. You got to bring the two birds together to get this song. And in a sense, what a book does is ideally, we have half of the symbol. It takes us into an event. In other words, it joins us to something that's happening. It doesn't show us something from the outside in. It takes us into what is happening as it's happening, and then it's happening with us. And only a metaphor, only a word that is metaphor, because a metaphor says two things could be one. So that is how two things could be joined in a living experience. And I think this is why works of literature mean through metaphors as opposed through signs that point to something else. They are trying to bring us into an event that happens within us. That leaves a very different kind of truth. And it also makes it an interesting kind of truth if you want to talk about it to somebody else. You see, it would be hard for somebody else to get what happened to you. But if you gave them half of a ticket too, and they followed that ticket to the other half and the experience happened to them, then the two of you would understand something that no amount of talking about, I think, could communicate.
Well, and I think in a simplistic way, that's why in education, they're pushing and talking about how reading builds empathy in kids. And that's like that first step of that, right? You're able to enter into something and experience something in a way that you can't experience because you don't live, in another country or whatever. I remember that was the big push after all the pushback with the Harry Potter books and the magic and all the fear. And it was like, no, it builds empathy because it gives you, like you said, it gives you have half the ticket, but it gives you that experience to make that whole. And that's why it's so important for kids to experience that at a young age so that as they grow, they can have, experience those in different ways.
That's a perfect example. This idea of empathy, right? If you were, for instance, and this relates to the cultural stuff, if you're going to understand, for instance, somebody that grows up in a different culture, what does an anthropologist do? An anthropologist doesn't stay in the library and read about. The anthropologist has to not only move to that place, the anthropologist has to live with this group of people within their cultural orbit, and not only briefly. An anthropologist has to live there for years, so that in a sense, the anthropologist begins to internalize and inhales the entire cultural world. And in that way, the anthropologist comes to understand what he or she could never understand from the library, including reading everything about the Maori people or the Kung people or whatever people. You would never understand those people until you participate in their life world. So that's, I think empathy is the word I should have used earlier, that unless you can enter into that person's life world. We talked about To Kill a Mockingbird, and this is what Atticus says to Scout, isn't it? If you want one simple trick, if you want to get along with other people, you learn to see things from their perspective. And then he adds something very concrete. You have to climb into their skin and walk around in it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of what I don't think it's kind of what we're talking about. I think that's what we're talking about. How could you walk around in another person's skin? And if there was an extent in which it's possibly true, then how could we ever understand people that we think of other? In other words, if we say you could never really do this, then we'd have to conclude you could never really understand someone who is other than you in profound ways. But I don't think we want to agree that that's impossible. So if it's not impossible, how do we do it?
I think in the book, Tim has a number of devices that he uses to create that kind of empathy with the characters in the book, like the letters from home, photographs, all these connections to home that actually they're kind of not, they're real, but they're kind of, what would I say, surreal. They're not tangible in some sense. It's a fantasy on the part of these soldiers of what they imagine life could be like if they were home, or what's happening in the reality that they presume is going on at home. That's very different than what's happening around them. And like there's questions about, well, what is reality and what's not, what's real, the things that's going on with the girlfriend back home, or my friend being blown up here in the jungle, and which person is hanging on to a reality or dealing with a reality. And he uses those devices to create empathy in the reader for those soldiers, but also there's so much more to it than just that. It's like, what's the sense of reality? How do you portray the horror of the war when your soldiers are trying to hang on to this surreal connection to home?
Okay, let's imagine, this is a great point. The difference between imaginatively entering into another person's being versus projecting. In other words, you could imagine that empathy could be actually, you could have the illusion of empathy, so that I'm projecting my fantasies into you, and I'm not really entering into you. I am simply entering into myself more deeply, using you as a screen. Now, wouldn't we say that this either or here is the difference between real love versus two people using each other, as psychologists call it, self objects? That the self needs an object to stimulate itself, etc. So what would be the difference between the other person being a self object and loving the other person? And I think Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carry, is a great example, because 9/10 or more of the characters actually don't enter into non. 9/10 of the characters do exactly what you just said, Steve. They project fantasies, or they hold on to an illusion that prevents them from going deep. Think about Henry Dobbins' stocking around his neck. This is his superstition. This is his little memento that relates back to America. In other words, to the extent that we hold on to our illusions, it incapacitates us from entering into another world, another person's being. And I want to say that this goes back to the chapter about the man I killed. Because if I'm not going to project into you, if I'm really going to enter into your being, then my ego has to die, because my ego is a projection making mechanism. My ego is, everywhere I go, my ego goes before me and projects itself into it. My ego, when we say people are narcissistic, what do we mean? That everywhere they go, there they are. And if you relate to a narcissistic person, you know they're using you as a self object. So if I'm going to actually experience the world as you experience, my ego has to die. The part of me that has to be everything has to become nothing, so that I can begin to be a host. This is where the spirit and ghost stuff comes in. My body has to host your spirit, but my body can't host your spirit if my ego is the threshold guardian. If my ego is standing there and doesn't want to disappear because its ego is terrified of disappearing, then it's going to have shields, it's going to have swords, it's going to have propaganda, it's going to have everything possible to keep it from disappearing. But if by some mechanism, a magic mechanism, the author can trick our ego into disappearing, and I think it does that by calling our imagination. I'm suggesting there's a difference between our imagination and our ego, is what I'm really saying. And that most of the time our ego contains our imagination. But if a writer can bring our imagination alive so that it comes out of the ego, then all of a sudden it's possible for me to experience you without projecting my fantasies into you. And this is what I think is at stake in art, and why it's different than propaganda, and why it is that the artist can't just tell you something directly, because they want you to participate in it, which means, another way of saying this is, the artist's whole magic is getting your ego to die, if only for a nanosecond, so that you can participate in what it means to be a Maori. So you can participate in what it means to be your neighbor. You can participate in what it means to be a Vietnamese, for example. Art is, I would say, the magic of making the viewer's ego, however transiently, disappear. And I think that's a great and wonderful art. And consider how it's the opposite of everything that works, so to speak, in most media, right? Wouldn't you say that most of media, the point is to stroke the anxieties of your ego so that you're enraged or you're terrified and your ego gets invested in holding its ground and of defeating the other. In other words, most kinds of communicative, anything we associate with propaganda, for instance, is going to make our ego more consolidated and fierce. In this sense, I think art is the opposite of propaganda because it can't achieve what it wants to achieve by manipulating your ego in that way. It has to do something far more difficult, far more magical. It's not hard to get someone's ego anxieties up. You can just remind them of their mortality. I mean, terror management theory says if you want to make someone's ego go into full blown, you just remind it that it's mortal. They've done this to judges. Before judges give a sentence, they will remind the judge of their mortality in a subliminal way. And the judge will give harsher sentences to the people that come before them because what are they doing? They're projecting their mortality anxieties into controlling the reality, and they're going to control reality by casting judgment on it. I'm just giving an example. It's not hard to get someone's ego to consolidate and to take up arms, but to get an ego to disappear or to lay down its arms, that I think is working with words in a very different way than how we typically are moved by words.
What you're talking about is the difference between ego and propaganda and empathy.
Or ego attached to propaganda versus empathy attached to art. Mm-hmm. That propaganda works by inflaming the ego, mm-hmm. and that art works by resurrecting an imagination that is buried beneath the ego's anxiety. So beneath the ego's anxiety, there is something that is not afraid of death because it doesn't die. Okay, there is something that has no fear of death because it is eternal. But that is buried beneath the ferocity of an ego that is terrified of its disappearance. So a work of art to move us in a way that we participate in what is not us. Okay, that's because that's what we're trying to do, have genuine empathy that's not a projection. For a work of art to achieve that transmutation, it has to pull off this feat of bringing this buried imagination or this eternal spirit out from under its burial beneath the ego's anxiety. And insofar as it achieves that, then it's the imagination that gets to participate in the other as opposed to the ego, if you see what I mean. And if you think about that little thing that I just described, this is why you could imagine something like the resurrection, even if you're an atheist. Julie, you talked about Ursula Le Guin. I'm an atheist. I believe in gods. Well, yes, but because she's an artist, right? So she believes, Shakespeare said the lover, the lunatic, and the poet are of imagination all compact. Ursula Le Guin saying I'm a poet. To that extent, she has something in common with the lunatic and the lover. She believes in God and the gods because gods are metaphors. What is Pluto? Pluto is part water and part human being, or part living being and part water. Every one of the Greek gods is part nature and part consciousness. Okay, so gods are built-in metaphors. And why is that important? Because the consciousness that can identify with water so strongly that it becomes a part of water. That's an imagination that is not being cut off by the ego. See, our ego keeps two things from becoming one, right? You can't fall in love with someone if there's two egos. It's like you can't make love to someone if you're both using each other as a self object. It's like billiard balls trying to copulate. Nothing happens, right? So in order for something to happen, our ego has to disappear. And I'm suggesting that an artist uses metaphors because metaphors can call our imagination in to participate in the meaning making. Our intellect can't do anything with metaphors. Our intellect, it's like a Zen coin. You give an intellect, I'm just talking about sheer rationality, okay? Sheer logic. If you give sheer logic a metaphor, it makes no sense. It's a lie, right? If you say that love is a rose to your intellect, that is a lie. This is what I'm getting back to your quote from Ursula Le Guin. If you tell the intellect that two things can become one thing, bone of bone and flesh of flesh, then they're going to say, well, you're just living in an illusion. But if you've ever fallen in love and you've experienced to yourself as part of another, then you know the intellect doesn't know what you know. And for you to communicate what you do know, you can't use logic because it doesn't make sense in those terms anymore. It makes sense on another level of consciousness. And metaphors make sense in another level of consciousness that does include our feelings. This is one of the great differences between the intellect and the imagination. The intellect is from the neck up. It's cut off from the body. The imagination includes the body in the thinking. The imagination thinks, but it thinks with feelings. It's a more integrated way of thinking. It's not a less than thinking. It's thinking that includes feeling.
I feel like what you're getting around to, Michael, is also like when we think about the title, The Things They Carried, it's real easy to think of tangible things that people carried with them. But in fact, I mean, I've seen it written that the human legs carried the bodies into Vietnam, and there's other ways to look at it. But I think it's also true that to think about when you talk about metaphor or some of the psychological or emotional baggage or the fantasies or the projections, all these things that we've mentioned also are things that people or that characters or that something in the book carried with them. And by taking this like massive depth of what the things might be also is something that Tim did that really, if a person considers that, deepens your understanding of what he's trying to achieve with the book.
Absolutely. And if you carry things in the latter sense, example you gave, let's say through memory or your affection, if you're carrying that person in that way, they're not a thing. In other words, the things you're carrying on your shoulder is not like the things you're carrying that you love. The things that you carry that you love are not things anymore. And their body and your body is one body, but the thing on your shoulder is a separate body. So that's partly things becoming no thing. That another thing for a no thing is a spirit. A thing that is no thing doesn't mean it's not real. It means it's not a thing.
Or separate realities where one thing is tangible and another thing is surreal.
So say that again.
So separate kinds of reality where one thing is tangible and the other thing is intangible or surreal.
Right. So if we were to take the intangible thing and carry it, it has to be transmute. If we're going to carry it within our body, as opposed to on our body, we would have to transmute that material thing into a spiritual thing.
Well, and that's all the ghosts in this story, right? I mean, there are a ton of ghosts in this story.
Yes.
And that's exactly what those are. It's all the people he's carrying with him from the age of 9 on, and how he's, incorporating all of those people into him to get him through the war, and then to help him deal with the aftermath of the war. And some of them didn't. Some of them, some of the guys he went to war with didn't do that and did not make it out, whether out of the war itself or either back into society.
That's wonderful. And if we imagine that if he is carrying all of these things, if he's the source of the carrying, then ultimately, no matter what he does with them in his head, if he's the source of their carrying and he's mortal, then the carrying is going to terminate because he's going to die. In other words, there is a limit to the everness, because that's the word he uses. There's a limit to the everness if he is the body that's doing the carrying. But if he himself is carried by something that is eternal. So this is a part of the trick here, that the letters that Jimmy Cross carries in the beginning, when this novel is over, if we have had an experience with it that is metaphorically like making love, if we have entered into it and it has entered into us, okay? If that happens, if the symbol that we carry connects with the symbol with the other half that it leads us to, and something happens between us, then the letters that Jimmy Cross was carrying turn out to be the letters in the form of this book that carry Tim's spirit. In other words, Tim's imagination is going to be carried by these letters. This book is going to carry Tim's spirit. This is what he says. He created this book to save Timmy's life. This is Tim creating this story to save Timmy's life. If he had,
which is why it's a love story and not a war story.
I just want to say, if that works, then when Tim O'Brien, the human being, dies, he won't be dead. Why? Because this will be his spiritual body.
I could be wrong, but I seem to recall that maybe Tim said something almost exactly like that when we asked him about writing the book, and that this book may transcend his own mortality.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You know why he's waking up at 4:30 in the morning and doing working on the final proofs edits? Because that's what he's doing. Mm-hmm. And he's not doing it because he feels obligated out of fear. Okay, this is not an anxiety. The ego cannot create. Okay, so if he was waking up at 4:30 out of anxiety and doing a bunch of stuff, he would be having panic attacks, and what would come of it would be nothing creative. The ego cannot do that. So what's motivating him, in other words, is the experience of love with letters. In other words, it is desire that is impelling him to create this body, not anxiety. He is intrinsically motivated. I've never had this happen to me, but they say if you ever have the perfect golf stroke, and this is a dumb analogy, they say if you ever have a perfect golf stroke, you will never quit golfing. And I'm going to propose that if you ever write a sentence, or more powerfully, a story in which something that is you and not you comes alive, and you know it because you're participating in it, I have a feeling that you won't want to stop doing that, because it might be far more intense than anything that's happening in the rest of your life.
But it does make for a good movie, though, that Legend of Bagger Vance, man.
Which one is it? What is the
Legend of Bagger Vance?
What is
if
that?
You haven't seen it, the stroke.
Oh man,
okay. You need to rent that this weekend.
Okay, The Legend of Bagger Vance.
The Legend of Bagger Vance. Will Smith and Matt Damon, I think.
Okay.
That's all about the stroke and God, and it's all those things right there.
Well, there you go.
So it wasn't a bad analogy.
Okay, but I think the point would be that what you said, that he really is creating a form, a spiritual form, that will have turned his biological life and all of the shit that happened in it. I mean, that's really the shit field, okay? How can you turn shit into gold? That's what this is really what it's saying. How do you take the shit of novel? And I'm using shit because the novel does. And the novel makes a point. If you don't like the word shit, then just forget experiencing a war. Okay. If you don't like the word shit, then you just stay home and watch your fireworks on the 4th of July picnic And because what does he say in the Norman Boker chapter? It was a town that didn't know shit about shit and didn't want to know shit about shit. Okay, I'm using that word because that is a lethal critique of people that want to live in their narcissistic projections and don't want to know what it is really like to participate in the other. In fact, to participate in the other part of your own body that you don't want to know about. All that stuff down there that you want to hide when you shit, you don't even want to know your own body. So forget understanding what it means to be a living being on this planet, because you're not going there. Okay, so I'm saying he, before he dies, is going to turn even the shit into something eternal.
And I think that sort of gets at maybe a bigger truth about this book, that this book is a spiritual experience. It's a spiritual look at Vietnam. It's a spiritual look at war. It's a spiritual look at what our veterans went through. It's a spiritual look at what the Vietnamese went through, about what our society went through. It's a spiritual look at that whole experience. And if you understand it in that way, I think a person might read the book a little bit differently.
I would say that's absolutely true if the reader has a spiritual experience with it. In other words, if the book is about a spiritual experience, that's not the same thing as a reader spiritually participating in it. So for one reader, this could be a spiritual book because his spirit participated in it. For another reader, it might be about the spirit, but being about the spirit is like the same thing as saying it's going to be about making love. It's going to be, are you going to eat the menu or are you going to eat the meal? So for one reader, it could be about any number of things, including the most transcendent things, and that reader not have entered into it. In other words, the ego can understand this book perfectly without ever getting out of the way.
So it begs the question to me, what does the reader need to bring to the book in order to have that spiritual experience?
I think the reader has to let go of the things that the reader cares. I think the reader, in a sense, the reader's ego has to disappear. That's what I've been trying to say. The reader's ego has to be the man that the reader kills. You see, the reader, a part of the reader that is terrified of dying, that's what I'm calling the ego, that can never experience anything except in its own image. It would be just like a person who's narcissistic. They can't make love. They can have sex, but they can't make love. That's what I'm trying to say. There are some people that can read books as self-objects. And then there are other people that have make love with books. I'm talking imaginatively now. And that's even more imaginatively is the only way you can make love. You know, the only way two things can become one would be imaginatively. You know, two people that are having physical interaction in which their imaginations are involved, if their egos get out of the way, they can make love. Two people whose imaginations aren't involved are not making love, okay? They could be having sex. I'm trying to use that as a very strong example here because I think this book is a love story, right? So I would say one reader could read this book and their ego not flinch, not even retreat. In fact, it could aggrandize. Another reader could read this experience and their ego could recede and perhaps for a moment disappear. And for that reader, it would be a spiritual experience because the reader in the book would have intercourse. For the other reader, the book will be a self-object.
Well, and Tim talks about that in the book. He says, you know, I tell this story and inevitably somebody comes up and says, it was a great story. You should put it all behind you and move on to new things. And he says, and all I can think of that I can't say out loud is you weren't listening. And he says, he's like, but I can't say that. All you can do is tell it one more time, patiently adding and subtracting, making up a few things to get to the real truth. And that I think too is what keeps him up at 4:30 or gets him up at 4:30. It's that drive to get one more person to hear what he's saying and to not miss the point.
Is it Rat Kiley or Kiowa, but one or the other, someone that he's close to dies? Is it Ted Lavender? I can't remember, but if it was Ted Lavender, maybe it's Rat Kyle. Okay. And he's going to write a family member, right? To communicate.
Right.
Okay. And he says, and the dumb coos doesn't write back. Now, this is another way of saying you didn't get into this with me. So that this book this is a wonderful book for learning how to read, because
that is that same chapter, because the last sentence of that chapter is, it's about love and memory, it's about sorrow, it's about sisters who never write back and people who never listen.
There you go. So you imagine you're a writer and you want people, metaphorically speaking, to enter in an act of love, an imaginative act of love. You want to enter into an experience with them. You don't want them to figure you out. You don't want them to have theories about you. And here's a real trick for smart people. I see this all the time when I read analysis of movies or books. Very smart people will come up with these elaborate metaphysical explanations, etc., and they will have not entered into a single image specifically. They will have generalizations, but they won't have paid attention to, for instance, colors. They won't have paid attention to why is this thumb hanging around Henry Dobbins' neck. That won't interest them. They'll be, what does he talk about? When Norman Boker had a friend named Max who was very interested in God and what was the final cause. And now Max is dead and maybe he knows. He's saying Max was talking all about God. I went over to Nam and I saw some shit. And I have a feeling that maybe Max won't understand what God is until Max lets go of all these concepts of God and goes over and has an intimate experience with shit. And anyone who has an understanding of a religion in which someone is resurrected, that's what they're saying. Unless you die and or come up a new being after you now know what shit is, because you have become shit. You become nothing. I'm using these words because the novel, not to be crude. The novel uses these words. So until you become nothing, you're not going to understand anything, because that other thing will always be you. You'll never understand it because you'll always recreate it in your image.
I feel like what the reader needs to bring to this book is a willingness to recognize and understand the symbols that Tim uses in it, because those are there very purposefully placed, and that's the way that they start to let go of that ego and to increase the empathy. And if somebody just reads it as, oh, there's a guy who had a thumb around his neck, without thinking about the thumb as a symbol and what's the meaning of that, they're going to have a different experience reading the book than the person who takes the time to understand those metaphors, those symbols, and what they mean.
I would say amen to that, because if we imagine the person's intellect as opposed to his imagination, the intellect cannot do anything with symbols, because symbols say two things or one thing. And the very premise of the intellect, Aristotle, the very premise, A is not B and B is not A. Okay, we work from that. This is the principle of exclusion. That's how the intellect works. The imagination says, no, in fact, love can be a rose. Jesus can be God, and two people can become one. The intellect says that's a lie. So I'm going to agree with you, Steve, completely, and say, unless the reader is willing to try to make sense of things, including his or her imagination, in other words, to let go of their intellectual dominance, unless they're willing to relax that figuring things out. Was it Mitchell Sanders? What's the moral? Okay, you've already lost it. You're still trying to figure it out. The point
he gives so many road signs. Like, why is there a book about Vietnam that's got a little 9-year-old girl in it? Like, what do the, he gives what the women are big road signs. Like, this is not what, this is not about war. This is about something else. Pay attention to this, and so, yeah, if you read it straight through and you don't see any of those things, and none of those things
haven't read it.
Then you haven't read the book. Right. Exactly. Then it's, you completely missed the point.
You came to the book and projected
yes
what you already believe, fear. Who knows? It's not, you didn't do it because you're bad. Okay. That's just how you know how to read. Okay. So you came to the book and recreated your image of the conceivable on the book as a blank screen.
And I one of the things that I loved about our discussion with Tim, where we could see each other's faces, was how excited he was when he realized that you were talking about, some of these metaphorical things, that you got them. I mean, it was, he almost got giddy. It was really cute, like he was so thrilled that this was going to be a conversation that was not going to just be about the baby buffalo and how sad that story was with the baby buffalo. It was exciting.
I hope he felt as gratified as I felt reading his book and feeling recognized. In other words, the parts in me, the imagination, felt recognized by what I was reading. C.S. Lewis said, we read to know that we're not alone. Well, I would say when my imagination read this book, it didn't feel alone. Mm-hmm. And so I hope he felt at least a portion of the recognition that my imagination felt reading his book. And I think if we think about that with regards to each other, recognizing each other is very different than figuring each other out.
Well, we said before we hit record, that we could probably do 6 more podcasts on this book. And I think that's probably true. Any kind of last minute thoughts to wrap up the podcast here? I'm so thrilled we did this book, because I had not read this book before. And this is definitely one that I'm going to be, in fact, I've already got plans. We're going to the Boundary Waters with family in September. And I've already told them, you have to read this book before we go, because we're going to light a fire and we're going to have a couple conversations. So
wonderful. Well, Boundary Waters is perfectly wonderful, because that's where he goes to when he goes to the Tip Top Lodge, right to the Boundary Waters. So
yes. Yeah.
Well, I just want to say what a delight it is to be in each of your companies. How much, not just for this particular book, but for all the books that we're doing, to be able to come together in a space in which we get to work together to experience something more intensely than we would experience without each other's company. That is a real delight, and very different than 3 people coming together and arguing over X, Y, or Z. And I just want to throw out again that one of the things that Works of Literature make possible is a kind of communication in which you don't have to be on the other team. And that's the sense in which it can be the basis of community in a way that other kinds of writing cannot be, because they mean by figuring them out. They do have a particular point, and you do get it better or less than another person, or you do have an opinion about it. Whereas these kinds of works, works of art, we can come together and we don't have to compete with each other, because we can experience it more deeply because of each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And our next book is Where the Crawdad Sings by Delilah Owens. We're going to be moving on to that one. But yeah, I don't know. This book's going to be, this one's not going away for a while. This is going to be sitting on my bookshelf for a long time, to be picked up whenever I feel the need to, have my imagination touch something a little bit bigger than my ego, for sure.
It's one of the things I'm guessing you carry now, right?
Absolutely. It is one of the things I will be carrying. Yep.
And I'm going to guess that book is partly carrying you, because insofar as you put your imagination into it, the everness about you, what is eternal in you, has entered into that book. And it's not that physical object, because it exists in a different kind of space. It exists in a space you can't find on a map. But I mean that in a very, very real sense, that insofar as you made something out of that book, then you have made something true that is not going to disappear when your biological body does. And if I didn't really, really believe that, I don't think that I would love reading, and I wouldn't certainly call it reading for life, because that's precisely what I mean by that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
See you
Thank
later,
you.
guys. God bless you. See you
All right.
soon.
Okay.